The gavel hit the wooden block with a sharp crack. The sound cut through the quiet courtroom, making my heart pound just a little faster. I had been in court before, but never like this. Never as the one standing at the defendant's table, facing a judge who didn't look pleased to see me. "Mr. Washington," Judge Reynolds said, adjusting his glasses as he glanced down at the papers in front of him. "You are in violation of court dress code." I frowned. "Excuse me, Your Honor." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "The cross around your neck. It is not permitted in this courtroom." I reached up instinctively, feeling the small silver cross resting just above the collar of my shirt. It had been there for as long as I could remember. I wore it at movie premieres, interviews, even charity events. No one had ever told me to take it off before. "With all due respect, sir," I said carefully, "I wasn't aware this was against any rule." Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "That's not an excuse. My courtroom has strict regulations. No religious symbols of any kind." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. I could feel eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. Beside me, my lawyer, Sarah, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor," she began, "we were not informed of this rule prior to—" "Enough," he interrupted. "This is not a debate." He picked up a piece of paper, scribbled something, then set it down. "I am issuing a fine of $5,000 for this violation." A stunned silence fell over the room. I stared at him. $5,000 for wearing a cross. His expression didn't change. "That is correct." I could hear a few gasps from the audience. Even the clerk looked surprised. Sarah turned to me, lowering her voice. "Denzel, we can handle this later. Just pay the fine and move on." I shook my head. "It's not about the money." Sarah sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I know it's not, but this judge isn't the type to back down." I wasn't either. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my tone level, "I respect your courtroom, but this isn't just about a rule. This is about my right to express my faith." The judge smirked slightly, folding his hands. "Are you a lawyer now, Mr. Washington?" I met his gaze. "Not officially, but I know the law." Something flickered in his expression. He wasn't expecting me to push back. I could see it in the way his fingers drummed against the bench, the way his jaw tensed slightly before he spoke. "The law," he said slowly, "does not override the rules of this courtroom. And the more you argue, the more you risk adding to that fine." I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to stay calm. Sarah tugged at my sleeve. "Denzel." I wasn't finished. "With all due respect, Your Honor," I said, "I believe this fine is unlawful." A few more murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir." I took a step forward. "And I'd like the chance to prove it." A brief silence stretched between us. Judge Reynolds studied me like I was a puzzle he hadn't quite figured out. Then, to my surprise, he leaned back in his chair, a small, amused smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Very well," he said. "If you think you can argue this fine, I will allow you to represent yourself." Sarah's eyes widened. "Your Honor, I strongly advise." He waved a hand. "Mr. Washington has made his choice." He turned back to me. "You wanted to challenge the law, Mr. Washington. Now's your chance." I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the table. I wasn't expecting this. But then again, neither was he. And I wasn't about to back down now. The room was still. Too still. It was the kind of silence that didn't just settle. It pressed down on you, made the air feel heavier. I could feel every set of eyes in that courtroom, waiting, watching, some curious, some doubtful, but no one more than Judge Reynolds. He sat there, fingers tapping lightly against the bench, studying me like he was waiting for me to break. Sarah leaned toward me, whispering under her breath, "Denzel, you don't have to do this." But I did. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about something bigger. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this fine is a violation of my rights." The judge sighed, shaking his head. "You celebrities always think you're above the rules." I got a reaction from the crowd, some chuckles, some murmurs. I didn't react. I wasn't here to entertain anyone. "Not at all, sir," I replied. "I respect the rules of this court, but respect goes both ways." His eyebrow twitched just slightly. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir." I gestured toward the cross still resting against my chest. The First Amendment protects religious expression. That includes wearing a cross. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. And yet, in this courtroom, my rules apply. You enter my court under my authority. That means you follow my standards. I could feel the tension shifting, like an invisible rope tightening between us. I kept my voice even. Respectfully, sir, that's not how the law works. A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Sarah shot me a quick glance, as if to say, be careful. Judge Reynolds exhaled slowly. You really think you're prepared to challenge this? I nodded. I do. The judge was silent for a moment, then turned to the prosecutor, James Connolly, who had been sitting quietly at the other table. James was a sharp-looking man, dressed in a crisp gray suit. He had been watching everything, eyes narrowed, expression unreadable. Mr. Connolly, the judge said, since Mr. Washington is so confident, I believe he should be properly challenged. Wouldn't you agree? James stood, buttoning his jacket. Absolutely, Your Honor. He turned toward me, smiling, but there was no warmth in it. Mr. Washington, I have one question for you. I nodded. Go ahead. James clasped his hands behind his back. Are you a lawyer? I didn't hesitate. No, sir. Have you ever studied law formally? No. He tilted his head slightly. Then why should this court take you seriously? The question hung in the air. I could feel the weight of it. He was trying to discredit me before I even got a chance to make my case. I didn't rush my answer. I let the silence stretch, made them wait for it. Then I said, because the truth isn't limited to lawyers. James blinked. It was subtle, but I caught it. He wasn't expecting that. I continued. The law is meant to protect people, not confuse them. I may not have a law degree, but I know my rights. And I know that fining someone for wearing a cross is not just unfair, it's unlawful. Judge Reynolds watched me closely. Then prove it. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A challenge. I nodded once. I'd be happy to. I turned toward the courtroom. Let's start with the basics. The Constitution guarantees religious freedom. That includes what a person wears, as long as it doesn't interfere with court proceedings. James crossed his arms. But courtrooms have dress codes. True, I agreed. But a dress code can't violate constitutional rights. If it does, it's invalid. The judge exhaled sharply. Mr. Washington, are you suggesting that I have issued an unconstitutional fine? I met his eyes. Yes, sir. The tension in the room was thick now, heavy enough to touch. Judge Reynolds leaned back, pressing his fingers together. That is a very serious accusation. I nodded, and I stand by it. He studied me, then turned to James. Mr. Connolly, I assume you're prepared to argue against this claim? James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to me. Mr. Washington, you say the Constitution protects your right to wear that cross in this courtroom. But what about the court's right to maintain neutrality? I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He spread his hands. A courtroom is a place of law, not personal beliefs. If we allow one religious symbol, we have to allow them all. That could cause distractions, even conflicts. The dress code exists for a reason. I considered his words. They sounded reasonable on the surface. But I knew better. I nodded slowly. I understand that concern. But neutrality doesn't mean banning religious expression. It means allowing all of it. James raised an eyebrow. So you're saying there should be no dress code at all? I shook my head. Not all. But a dress code that singles out religion isn't neutral. It's discriminatory. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. You're arguing as if this is a Supreme Court case, Mr. Washington. I met his gaze. Because the rights in question are just as important here as they are in the highest court. Another silence. Judge Reynolds exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then he said, You have one chance to convince me, Mr. Washington. Choose your next words carefully. I took a deep breath. The real fight was just beginning. I could hear my own heartbeat. The courtroom was silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant people weren't paying attention. It was the kind that came when everyone was hanging on to every single word, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Reynolds was still watching me, his expression unreadable. James Connolly was standing tall, adjusting the cuff of his suit, like he already knew he had this in the bag. Sarah, still beside me, looked tense. She hadn't said a word since the judge told me I had one chance to make my argument. I knew what that meant. One wrong word, one weak point, and this whole thing was over. I took a deep breath and kept my voice steady. Your Honor, before I present my argument, I'd like to ask a question. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Go on. I turned to James. Mr. Connolly, you said that allowing religious symbols in court could cause distractions. Do you believe that my cross is distracting this courtroom? James didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered to the judge, then back to me. That's not the point. I nodded. It is actually, because if the argument is that my cross disrupts the court, then we should see some kind of evidence of that. I turned, glancing around the room. Is anyone here struggling to focus because of it? The silence stretched. I let it. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. That is not how the law works, Mr. Washington. I nodded again, unfazed. I understand, Your Honor. But the law is based on reason, isn't it? If we're going to enforce a rule, there has to be a valid reason behind it. James took a step forward. The reason is courtroom neutrality. The law must be applied equally to all, without influence from personal beliefs. I met his eyes. Then why do judges swear on the Bible before taking the bench? A few murmurs rippled through the audience. James didn't react, but I could tell he was caught off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, choosing his words carefully. That is tradition, he said finally. I tilted my head. And does that tradition interfere with courtroom neutrality? James exhaled, clearly annoyed. It is not the same thing. I nodded, like I was considering his words. All right, let's try something else. Your Honor, if a person walked into this courtroom wearing a yarmulke, would they be fined? The judge didn't answer immediately. He glanced at James. James cleared his throat. This court does not allow any religious symbols. I looked at them both. Well, you're saying a Jewish man would have to remove his yarmulke before entering? Another pause. I pressed forward. And what about a woman wearing a hijab? Would she be fined too? James' jaw tensed. He hesitated for just a second, but it was enough. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. People were shifting, whispering. Even the clerk glanced up from his papers. Judge Reynolds held up a hand. Enough. This is not a debate about hypothetical situations. I met his gaze. But it's the same principle, isn't it? If this fine is really about neutrality, then it has to be enforced across the board. James exhaled sharply. Mr. Washington, with all due respect, you are not a lawyer. You are an actor. You may be able to give a convincing speech, but that does not change the law. I didn't react to the insult. Instead, I just smiled slightly. That's fair. But I do know something about storytelling, Mr. Connolly. And right now, the story being told in this courtroom doesn't add up. Judge Reynolds rubbed his temples. Mr. Washington, if you are suggesting that my ruling is unfair, you had better have something stronger than words to back it up. I nodded. I do, Your Honor. I'd like to reference a Supreme Court case. James frowned. A Supreme Court case? Yes, sir. I turned back toward the judge. Marsh versus Chambers, 1983. The Supreme Court ruled that religious expression in government spaces is protected. Judge Reynolds leaned back slightly, but his expression didn't change. That case involved prayer in legislative meetings, not dress codes. I nodded. That's true, but the principle is the same. The court ruled that just because something religious happens in a government setting doesn't mean it violates neutrality. The same logic applies here. James shook his head. That is a stretch, Mr. Washington. I shrugged. Not really. If allowing religious practice in a legislative chamber doesn't violate neutrality, then why would a cross in a courtroom? The tension in the room had shifted. James was no longer relaxed. He wasn't smiling anymore. Judge Reynolds was watching me carefully, like he was actually considering my words. Then the judge tapped his gavel lightly. You have presented an interesting argument, Mr. Washington. But the law is not decided on persuasive words alone. I nodded. I understand that, sir. He sighed. Very well. I will review your argument carefully before making a final decision. James immediately turned to him. Your Honor. Reynolds held up a hand. That is all for now, Mr. Connolly. I didn't let myself react. Didn't let the relief show on my face. This wasn't a victory. Not yet. But I had done what I needed to do. I had given him something to think about. Now I just had to wait. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded in front of me, eyes fixed on the judge. The air in the courtroom had changed. The energy, the weight of it, something was different. Before, people were just watching. Now they were invested. They wanted to see what happened next. Judge Reynolds sat still, staring down at the papers in front of him. He hadn't said a word since he told me he would review my argument. His fingers drummed lightly against the bench, his jaw tight. Sarah leaned toward me, her voice barely above a whisper. Denzel, I've never seen him take this long to make a decision. I didn't look away from the judge. That means he's thinking. She let out a slow breath. Or looking for a way to shut this down. Maybe, but something told me it wasn't that simple. James Connolly was sitting at the prosecution's table, his expression blank, but his fingers were wrapped tightly around his pen. He was waiting too. Then, finally, Judge Reynolds spoke. Mr. Washington, your argument was unexpected. I kept my face calm. Yes, sir. I have reviewed the legal precedent you referenced, he continued, tapping the papers in front of him. While it does not directly address courtroom dress codes, it does raise a question of constitutional interpretation. James straightened. Your Honor, if I may. Reynolds held up a hand, silencing him. Then he looked back at me. I am willing to hear further argument before making a final ruling. Sarah's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. I could hear the whispers spreading through the courtroom. James let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Your Honor, with all due respect, you're seriously considering this? Reynolds didn't even glance at him. I am. James's smile was tight, forced. On what grounds? Reynolds finally looked his way. On the grounds that if I am to fine a man $5,000, I should be absolutely certain that the fine is lawful. James hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned. I sat up straighter. Thank you, Your Honor. Reynolds sighed. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Washington. If you wish to continue, you must present a stronger case. Words alone will not be enough. I nodded. I understand. Reynolds glanced at the clock. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. Court adjourned. The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. For now. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. My mind was already racing. Stronger case. I needed something undeniable. Something the judge couldn't ignore. Sarah placed a hand on my arm. Denzel, we need to talk. Now. I nodded. Let's go. We left the courtroom together, stepping out into the hallway, where reporters were already gathering, cameras flashing, voices shouting my name. I ignored them. Right now, none of that mattered. Sarah pulled me into a quiet corner, lowering her voice. You realize what just happened in there? I nodded. I got him to listen. She shook her head. No, Denzel. You did more than that. You made him question his own ruling. Do you know how rare that is? I ran a hand over my chin. I just gave him something to think about. She sighed. And now he's giving you a chance to make your case. That means we have work to do. I looked at her. What are you thinking? She crossed her arms. We need more than words, Denzel. We need legal precedent. We need cases that prove your argument without a doubt. I nodded. Then let's find them. She hesitated. Denzel, this is bigger than just you. I met her eyes. I know. She let out a breath. All right, let's get to work. We had one night to prepare. One night to find the proof we needed. Because tomorrow, I wasn't just defending myself. I was fighting for something bigger. The courtroom was packed. More people than yesterday. Reporters lined the back, their cameras flashing every few seconds. I could hear the low hum of voices, people whispering, waiting. Something was different today. The energy had changed. Judge Reynolds sat at the bench, his fingers laced together. He looked calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He knew today was important. So did I. James Connolly sat at the prosecution table, flipping through his notes. He wasn't smiling anymore. That told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't underestimating me today. Sarah placed a hand on my arm. You ready? I nodded. More than ever. The judge tapped his gavel twice. Court is now in session. The murmurs died instantly. Reynolds glanced at me. Mr. Washington, yesterday you argued that your fine was unconstitutional. Today, I expect you to prove it. I stood, buttoning my jacket. Yes, Your Honor. Proceed. I turned to face the courtroom. Your Honor. I spent last night reviewing every case I could find related to this issue, and I found something. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I'm sure you did. I ignored him. Your Honor, I'd like to present West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. Reynolds narrowed his eyes slightly. Go on. I took a deep breath. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that the government cannot force individuals to act against their religious beliefs. Students were being forced to salute the flag, but the court said that was unconstitutional. Reynolds nodded slowly. I remember the case. I continued. If the government can't force someone to salute the flag, then how can a courtroom fine someone for wearing a religious symbol? James shifted in his seat. He wasn't comfortable anymore. I turned toward him. Mr. Connolly, does the government have the right to force people to act against their religious beliefs? James hesitated. He knew where I was going with this. Finally, he said, no. I nodded. Then why is this fine justified? James exhaled sharply. That's not the same thing, Mr. Washington. I raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? The room was dead silent. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly. Mr. Connolly, do you have a response? James stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, while Mr. Washington's argument is compelling, it does not change the fact that this court has the right to enforce a dress code. I turned to face him. And does that dress code apply equally to everyone? James paused. Yes. I didn't look away. Then let's test that. I gestured toward the audience. Your Honor, I'd like to ask a simple question. Has anyone here ever worn a religious symbol in this courtroom before? There was silence for a long moment. Then, a man in the back slowly raised his hand. He wore a suit, glasses resting on his nose. Judge Reynolds turned toward him. State your name. The man cleared his throat. David Klein, Your Honor. Reynolds nodded. And what is your profession? I'm a defense attorney. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. And you've worn a religious symbol in this courtroom before? David nodded. Yes, sir. The judge's jaw tightened. Were you ever fined? David shook his head. No, sir. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. James shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, that is irrelevant. Reynolds held up a hand. I will decide what is relevant, Mr. Connolly. James fell silent. I took a deep breath. Your Honor, this proves that the dress code is not applied equally. If one person can wear a religious symbol without consequence, then why am I being fined? Reynolds exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. You are making a serious claim, Mr. Washington. I nodded. Yes, sir. And I stand by it. The room was completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, finally, Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. I need time to consider this, he said. Court is adjourned until further notice. The gavel came down. I let out a slow breath. I wasn't sure what would happen next. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The courtroom doors closed behind me, but I could still hear the murmurs from inside. Reporters were waiting in the hallway, cameras flashing, voices calling my name, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. I kept walking. Sarah was right beside me, moving fast, her expression tense. We need to talk, she said under her breath. I nodded, and we turned down a quieter hallway, away from the crowd. Once we were alone, she let out a deep breath and faced me. Denzel, this case is turning into something bigger than we expected, she said. You realize what you just did in there? I met her eyes. I pointed out the truth. She shook her head. You exposed a flaw in the system. That's not something they're just going to let slide. I knew she was right. Judge Reynolds wasn't the only one thinking about my argument. The people in that courtroom, the reporters outside, even James Connolly, they all felt it. The weight of what had just happened. Sarah ran a hand through her hair. Denzel, I've been looking into cases all morning. There are others, people who were fined or penalized for similar reasons, but never had the chance to fight back. This isn't just about your cross anymore. I nodded slowly. Then we fight for them, too. She sighed. I knew you were going to say that. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and saw an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Mr. Washington, a deep voice said. I recognized it immediately. Judge Reynolds. I glanced at Sarah. Yes, Your Honor. There was a pause. I need you to come back to my chambers. Now. I didn't ask why. I just said, I'll be there. The line went dead. Sarah frowned. What was that? I slipped the phone into my pocket. The judge wants to see me. She stared at me. Alone? I nodded. She looked uneasy. Denzel, be careful. I gave her a small nod before heading back down the hall. The courtroom was empty now, just a few clerks gathering papers. I made my way toward the judge's chambers, pausing for only a second before knocking. Come in, his voice called. I pushed the door open. Judge Reynolds was sitting behind his desk, hands folded, his face unreadable. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. I did. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just studied me. Then, finally he spoke. Mr. Washington, do you understand the position you've put this court in? I held his gaze. I presented a legal argument, Your Honor. His lips pressed into a thin line. And in doing so, you've raised questions that people are now demanding answers to. I didn't say anything. He exhaled. This isn't just about you anymore. If I rule in your favor, it will set a precedent. If I rule against you, people will question whether this court truly upholds fairness. He leaned forward slightly. Either way, this case does not end here. I nodded. I understand. He studied me for a moment longer. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. I hesitated before picking it up. When I opened it, my stomach tightened. Inside were documents, cases just like mine. People fined, punished, or denied rights based on similar rulings. Some had fought back. Most had lost. I looked up at him. What is this? His voice was quiet. The cases they don't want you to know about. I frowned. Why are you showing me this? He leaned back. Because whether I like it or not, this case is going to change things. And before I make my ruling, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I flipped through the pages, my hands steady. Names, dates, court decisions, it was all there. Judge Reynolds watched me carefully. Tell me, Mr. Washington, are you ready for what comes next? I met his eyes. Yes, Your Honor. He studied me for another long moment. Then he nodded. Then I suggest you be in this courtroom first thing tomorrow morning. I closed the folder, my mind racing. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, the courtroom was fuller than ever. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made people sit a little straighter, breathe a little quieter. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready. The public benches were packed, faces I didn't recognize watching, waiting. I sat at my table, hands folded, trying to stay calm. Sarah was beside me, flipping through papers, but I could tell she wasn't really reading them. She was just keeping her hands busy. Denzel, she murmured, no matter what happens today, you did something big. I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the folder Judge Reynolds had given me. The cases, the names, the people who had fought and lost. This wasn't just about me anymore. The door at the front of the courtroom opened, and Judge Reynolds stepped in. The room fell silent. He walked to the bench, adjusting his robe before sitting down. He didn't look at anyone. Not at me, not at James Connolly, not at the crowd. Then he spoke. This court has spent the last 24 hours reviewing the legal arguments presented in this case, he said, his voice steady. It has also reviewed past cases that raise similar constitutional concerns. James straightened in his seat, but he didn't speak. He was waiting, just like the rest of us. Judge Reynolds finally looked at me. Mr. Washington, before I make my ruling, do you have anything else to add? I stood. My legs felt steady, my voice strong. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I have one last question. He nodded. Proceed. I turned to face the courtroom. My voice was clear. If the law isn't applied equally to everyone, is it really the law? A murmur spread through the room. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel once, quieting it. I turned to him. Yesterday, I proved that the dress code wasn't applied equally. I was fined, but others weren't. That's not just unfair, it's unconstitutional. James stood suddenly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is... Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. Sit down, Mr. Connolly. James hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Judge Reynolds turned back to me. You argue that this fine is unconstitutional because it is not enforced equally? I nodded. Yes, sir. He tapped his fingers against the bench, thinking. Then, after a long pause, he said, the law must be fair. If it is not applied fairly, it cannot stand. The room was dead silent. Judge Reynolds let out a slow breath. This court finds that the fine imposed upon Mr. Washington was not applied equally and, therefore, is unconstitutional. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reynolds raised his gavel. The fine is dismissed. The gavel came down, and the room exploded. Reporters jumped from their seats, people whispering, talking, shouting questions. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with shock. "You did it," she whispered. I exhaled, but I didn't sit down. Not yet. Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. He tapped his gavel again, bringing the room back to order. Then he looked directly at me. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice quieter now, "this ruling does not erase the fact that there are others who have faced similar fines, similar punishments." I nodded. "I know." He studied me for a moment. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" I met his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." He gave a small nod. "Then I suggest you prepare yourself." I didn't know what he meant, but I was about to find out. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. I had expected some attention, but nothing prepared me for the storm that followed. News outlets picked up the story faster than I could have imagined. Headlines screamed about the court ruling for religious freedom, Washington's victory, and a new precedent set in court. Everywhere I went, people recognized me, some with smiles, some with stares. It was hard to go anywhere without feeling the weight of it all. But the worst part? The phone calls. Every hour a new one came in, lawyers, journalists, even strangers. Some offered congratulations. Others tried to offer advice or push their own agendas. But the one that stood out was the call I received late that night. "Mr. Washington?" I sat up straight. It was a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Judge Reynolds," I said. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something in his voice told me this wasn't just about my case anymore. "I'll be there," I said before hanging up. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. I wasn't sure what was coming, but I knew it would be big. By the time I arrived at his office, the lights were dim. The door to his office was slightly ajar, and I knocked lightly before stepping inside. He was sitting behind his desk, his face lined with exhaustion. "Mr. Washington," he said, not looking up. "Please sit." I did, but my mind raced. What was going on? "I've been receiving calls," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "A lot of them. About you, about your case, about the ruling." I nodded, but I stayed silent. He sighed deeply. "You've become a symbol, whether you want to be or not. People are asking for more. They want to know how far this ruling goes, what it means for future cases." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What are you saying, Your Honor?" He stood up slowly, pacing back and forth. "I'm saying that this case, this ruling, is just the beginning. You've opened a door, and now others want to walk through it. People are demanding change, Mr. Washington." I rubbed my temples, but I didn't ask for this. "I know," he said, his voice softer, "but it doesn't matter. You've taken a stand, and now it's bigger than any one person. It's about the future of how we interpret the law when it comes to religious freedoms and personal expression." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. "So what's next?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Next is the hard part, the fight. There will be those who will try to undo everything you've accomplished." I didn't flinch. "I'm ready for that." He smiled faintly, almost as if he had expected me to say that. "Good, because it's going to get ugly. The next few months will be critical. You're going to face opposition from every side, but you can't back down. Not now." I nodded, though a small part of me questioned if I was truly prepared. The judge's voice softened again. "But remember, Mr. Washington, the law isn't black and white. It's fluid, and sometimes those who fight for change are the ones who face the harshest consequences." I thought about that for a long moment. I didn't start this fight for myself. I started it because I believe in something. He studied me closely. "What do you believe in?" I didn't hesitate. "I believe in fairness, in equality, in the right to express who you are without fear." He nodded slowly, as if he respected my conviction. "Then stand by it, no matter what happens next." Just as I was about to leave, he stopped me. "One more thing, Mr. Washington," he said, his voice a little sharper now. "This case isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced or punished for standing up for what they believe in. You're not alone in this. I felt a weight settle in my chest. I know. I stood up to leave, but before I reached the door, Judge Reynolds spoke again. Be prepared, Denzel, he said quietly. It's about to get much harder. I left his office feeling more conflicted than ever. The reality of what was happening settled in. It wasn't just about me anymore. People were watching, waiting to see if the system would bend or break. If I could keep fighting or if I would fall. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything I'd fought for. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready. Because sometimes, doing what's right meant walking into the unknown, knowing the fight might get harder before it got easier. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.